Good afternoon, everyone. This is Paz Ardasa Regan, Program Manager at Catholic Climate Covenant. We are going to give folks a few more seconds before we get started. We probably will have full capacity for this webinar. So I'm going to just wait a few seconds. Okay, let us get started. Well, as I said, I'm Paz Ardasa Regan. I'm staff with Catholic Climate Covenant, and I am thrilled to be welcoming you today to this webinar, A Laudato Si Lens on Environmental Justice. The focus on environmental justice is incredibly timely and important in 2021, as we as a society are coming to terms with the multifaceted issues of poverty and race and systemic racism and injustice. As always, we get our webinar started with a moment of prayer. So if you would join me, centering ourselves and remembering that we're always in the presence of God. And this prayer is particularly poignant because it uses one of my favorite scripture passages from Micah 6:8. He has shown you, O mortal, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? To act justly, to love mercy, and to walk humbly with your God. Creator God, you call us as inhabitants of this world to act justly and to love mercy and to walk humbly with you. And yet this is so often absent from our experience and feels beyond our ability. We found hope as we recognize and confess our failings, whether as individuals or institutions. Confronting racial injustice and recognizing its harms towards others can be painful, but the pain for those subjected to this injustice is greater. May we have the courage to act justly. May we have mercy in order to avoid harming others by action or inaction. May we find the humility to acknowledge our failings for the sake of our country, our world, creation, and those created in your image. May this come to pass. And it's a prayer from Climate Caretakers. Little housekeeping before we get going. If any of you are having audio issues, I recommend that if that might be a Wi-Fi issue, you can use your phone as the audio. You can find the directions for how to switch to your phone in the audio box in your control panel. Please submit questions in the questions box. And if your question is to one of the specific speakers, please let me know so I know who to address it to. The webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent to you within the next 24 to 48 hours. Well, the issue of environmental justice, of how poor and of color communities are disproportionately impacted by pollution, environmental degradation, and also excluded in the vital environmental policies and decisions is extremely close to my heart. This is the issue where I got started in the community, the church world. This webinar is the first of a two-part series that will delve on the critically important issue of environmental justice. The second part of the series, it will be scheduled in February, and will continue our focus on firsthand stories from impacted communities, and especially on how Catholics can accompany those working on issues of environmental justice. At the moment, let me introduce you to our two speakers. Dr. Catherine Wright will unpack the meaning of environmental justice and how Catholic social teaching, in particular Laudato Si, gives us the helpful lens to view and act on this important issue. Veronica Coptis will present on her organization's respectful collaboration with area residents living with the daily impacts of fossil fuel extraction to improve oversight of an accountability for fossil fuel extraction and use and promote public and environmental health. Dr. Wright is a Canadian eco-theologian working at Wingate University in North Carolina in the Religion and Philosophy Department and as the executive director of Wingate's Collaborative for the Common Good. For the past 6 years, she has taught a wide variety of courses, including eco-theology, religion and science, systemic theology, and global perspectives and ethics. Her passion is working alongside campus and community partners, laboring to empower others to wholeness and happiness and building resilient, just communities. Her 3 fur babies keep her grounded, as does her gardens, her daughter Draven, and husband Todd. Speaking second will be Veronica Coptis, who is with the Center for Coalfield Justice. She joined the center in March 2013 as a community organizer and now is their executive director. She grew up in Western Greene County near the Bailey Mine Complex in the eastern part of the county in Pennsylvania. Before joining the CCJ staff, she served on the board of directors for CCJ and organized with the Mountain Watershed Association. She received a bachelor's degree in biology from West Virginia University, and she enjoys hiking and geocaching at Ryerson State Park and other areas around her county with her husband and daughters. So at this point, I am glad to pass it on to Catherine, who I will give control now of the keyboard. Catherine, it's yours.
Wonderful. It's such a pleasure to be with you here today to speak about environmental justice as creation care. So Catholics and people of all faiths are waking up to the truth that creation care really means to work to eradicate racism, poverty, and hatred of all forms embedded in the many systems within our human communities. So creation care is central to Christian discipleship, and this emerges from core Catholic social teachings. So in paragraph 202 of Laudato Si, just getting my slides. So Paz, I don't think I have access yet. So if you can, or you can change the slide for me if you like.
I have given you keyboard and mouse. It is not working for you?
No, it is not. So if you can advance a slide, that would be
Sure.
wonderful. So in paragraph 202, Pope Francis outlines 3 pivotal truths or frameworks for environmental justice. So humans, our planetary and cosmic neighbors, have a common origin, the Creator, God. This is the source of the intrinsic value of all life and the sacredness of creation. The second framework is our planetary home is a universal communion of many subjects who mutually belong to each other as beloved sons and daughters of God. Our entire planetary family is interconnected and interdependent, and our many responsibilities to care for each other stem from this reality. The third framework is that everyone and everything in our universe shares a destiny, and nothing and no one is excluded from this promise of fullness of life with God. So this framework allows us to look at environmental degradation and human oppression as 2 distinct yet interconnected forms of sin. And today I want to lean into 2 paragraphs in Laudato Si as we begin this 2-part series. I want you to invite you to carry them with you when you are listening to the stories of our planetary neighbors from people like Veronica and the Center for Coalfield Justice. So next slide. So the first I want you to percolate on is paragraph 49. It says, today, however, we have to realize that a true ecological approach always becomes a social approach. It must integrate questions of justice in debates on the environment so as to hear both the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor. So both cries stem from ideologies or patterns of thinking and doing that privileges the lives and the concerns of a few in our human community over all other life on this planet. In our way of living and loving on this planet, in our social constructs, culturally, in our economic systems, in our political platforms, in the way that we develop our communities, we have pushed so many forms of life to extinction. And this includes many in our human family. We have polluted the air, sea, and the land. We are warming and acidifying our oceans. We have degraded the environment, and this is aiding the spread of viruses like the coronavirus. We force people to live in poverty. We traffic the most vulnerable. We incarcerate and institutionalize unjustly, and we have changed the very topography, the face of the earth and her life forces. So none of these issues live in isolation. They are intertwined. And hope lies in waking up to a broad horizon of love that is at the heart of creation care and environmental justice. And once awoken, the commitments within Catholic social teaching and papal letters like Laudato Si will lead people of faith to reject the widely accepted norms and practices that are at the root of ecological and social crises. So creation care lives at the intersection of ecological, social, and economic justice. It is intergenerational, an advance that everyone is allowed to contribute and participate and collaborate in well-being. This is the horizon of God's love. So next slide. As Catholics, we have a special voice to speak about justice, but it can only happen when creation care is not seen as optional, but as an actual core moral issue for Catholics. So this leads to the second quote I want you to lean into. Paragraph 116 is written, "An inadequate presentation of Christian anthropology, the relationship of God, humanity, and creation, gave rise to a wrong understanding of the relationship between human beings and the world. Often what was handed on was a Promethean vision of mastery of the world, which gave the impression that the protection of nature was something only the faint-hearted cared about. Instead, our dominion over the universe should be understood more properly in the sense of responsible stewardship." And I'm going to talk later about right relationship, and this is the heart of stewardship. So creation care is rooted in living in right relationship, grounded in a belief in our common origin, our mutual belonging, and our shared destiny. So it's important to now look at what endorsing these three frameworks really means today. So next slide. So to set the tone for exploring the intertwining threads of justice and Laudato Si, I want to begin by mentioning a podcast originally recorded in March 2020 at the beginning of the pandemic. It is part of a series called Intersectionality Matters, hosted by Kimberly Crenshaw. She's an American lawyer, a civil rights activist, and also a scholar who introduced the theory of intersectionality in 1989. This is a concept that will help us understand Laudato Si' nuanced call to creation care and see it as a call for justice for all. So Kimberly Crenshaw used the theory of intersectionality to explain the oppression of African American women through the compounded discrimination experienced as a group belonging to two marginalized communities, African Americans and women. So our identities are very complex. For example, I'm a mother, I'm a scholar practitioner, I'm a Canadian, I'm a former competitive football player, a woman, I'm affluent, and I'm white. So identities are often based on groups like race or gender or sexual orientation or ability status. And in marginalized groups, undervaluing or even vilification can be attached to any or all of these parts of our identity, and that is the compounding effect. So understanding intersectionality is important to be able to know and act on the many levels of justice work that's being demanded by creation care. This is why Pope Francis and Catholic social teaching critique social and economic systems in their address of environmental concerns. So intersectionality allows us to see creation care as a broader horizon for justice. So in this podcast, she had many guests, and they spoke about the disproportionate impact of the coronavirus on very specific members of our human family, and they explored the reasons why. So COVID-19 has made the social and financial and political inequalities that define life for so many very, very visible. This is the first step to justice, awakening to these complex systems that inhibit fullness of life for so many, and how ecological degradation and human injustice go hand in hand. So there's a voice from the podcast that I want you to hear, and it'll be our springboard into the justice framework of Laudato Si. So it's Dr. Dorothy Roberts. She's a professor of law and sociology at the University of Pennsylvania. She indicated that many believe that differences in how disadvantaged a person is stems from a biological defect, and that many believe this is just a normal part of nature. It just is. This fiction placates and hides from our scrutiny human-made inequalities that lead to the disadvantage that people take on in our society. So for example, members of low-income communities and communities of color experience higher levels of infant mortality rate, maternal mortality rates, deaths from surgery. They also have a different level of care with respect to pain management. They also have higher rates of obesity, diabetes, heart disease, and lung problems. We have the data to show this. These have roots in systemic injustice. It's not biological defect. So when these individuals are then forced to live in spaces that are polluted and toxic or degrading, these preconditions are only made worse. These communities also take longer to bounce back from natural disasters, and they're more susceptible to global pandemics like COVID-19 because of deep-seated discrimination that manifests itself as a lack of support structures and a lack of investments. So the lack of health insurance, the lack of job security, agricultural dependent economies, energy poverty, educational poverty, internet poverty. So better resourced communities have ways to mitigate the effects of storms or ecological degradations and pandemics, and poorer communities do not. Next slide, please. So Robert Bullard, a longtime environmental justice advocate, brilliantly spoke recently about how the coronavirus is like a heat-seeking missile zeroing in on the most vulnerable, who also are the recipients of human hate and discrimination. He said, if you have areas with the highest concentration of pollution and sick people, people who have been made sick by racism and zoning and permitting, and you have a lot of diabetes and heart disease and kidney disease, the virus is going to seek that out. And data shows that is in fact the case. So your zip code speaks very loudly to how healthy you are. But low-income communities and communities of color are also more exposed to environmental hazards because they do not have the ability to successfully fight political decisions that put them in their backyard. Often they're not even part of the discussion. For example, in the podcast, the story was told by the host about something that happened in Chicago last March. A news story reported how polling stations were moved from affluent senior care facilities to facilities run by Chicago Public Housing Authority due to a concern for coronavirus. That is a direct statement about who is valuable and who is not. This is why advocates of creation care need to step up and name when this is happening, and then make space at the political, social, and economic tables that they are at for those who are overlooked, to allow them to speak for themselves and collaborate in the decision-making that affects their lives. Next slide. Catholics who care for creation must wake up, thank you, to the intersection of social, economic, and ecological conditions that contribute to human and ecological oppression if we truly believe in our common origin, mutual belonging, and shared destiny. So Pope Francis in the Catechism of the Catholic Church is very clear. God wills the interdependence of creatures. Creatures exist only in dependence on each other to complete each other. in the service of each other. We have not lived these truths very well, and the path to right relationship starts with an awareness of our common origin, our mutual belonging, and our shared destiny. This is the justice framework and our path forward. So to serve the poor, the differently abled, the elderly, the hungry in our human family means we must also protect our common home. We have the power to disrupt Earth's life systems, and this is exacerbating social constructs that keep so many oppressed. So to love God and our neighbors as ourselves, this takes on new meaning today and new spiritual importance. It may be something that Christians in the past did not have to deal with, like climate change, but we are not left without a roadmap. So theology from Laudato Si does offer signposts for us. Next slide. So a significant signpost is Pope Francis's theology of God creator as the root of this common origin. So for Pope Francis, God is all powerful, eternally steadfast, and God expresses this through creativity and empowerment. Love is the origin of all things. It's the thread that binds everything together. Love was present at the birth of our universe billions of years ago and will continue to be present until end time, when the cosmos rests again in God's loving embrace. So throughout Laudato Si, but especially in paragraph 77, Pope Francis reminds readers of the cosmic expansiveness of God's love and justice. Our world desperately needs this. So he writes, the universe did not emerge as a result of arbitrary omnipotence, a show of force, or a desire for self-assertion. Creation is the order of love. Even the fleeting life of the least being is the object of God's love. And in its few seconds of existence, God enfolds it with affection. So this resonates in the 7 themes of Catholic social teaching, and it connects them all. A belief in the sacredness and dignity of human life is deeply connected to the social teaching on solidarity, rights and responsibilities, dignity in work and workers, and care of creation, all of them in between. So creation care is not optional, but essential if you want to fulfill all the 7 Catholic social teachings. But our creation care, this is the question I have for all of us here. Does our creation care extend beyond purely protection of natural spaces and recycling? They're both important, but do they have a cosmic horizon? Creation care does mean recognizing the intrinsic worth and irreplaceable value of those who inhabit Earth. When we dismiss the sacredness of creation, we also are stripping members of our human family of dignity and worth. We push them to the margins, we incarcerate them, we eradicate them. God, who loves abundantly, models for us how to care for all our planetary neighbors. We are made in the image and likeness of a God who is characterized by love, creativity, empowerment, and relationality. And creation care should be our how we live this out. So another signpost in Laudato Si speaks of, next slide please, mutual belonging and a shared destiny. And the signpost is the Incarnation. So in Laudato Si, we can explore many of the dusty depths of the Incarnation, and it reveals a lot about environmental justice. Doctrines from the early church emphasize Christ's full humanity and full divinity. But thanks to modern science, we understand life in a totally new way. So like us and other creatures, Jesus was literally stardust. The oxygen in his lungs, the calcium, the carbon in his body, his inspirited body interplayed with the Galilean landscape, where he fed himself, sweat, hugged his mother, played with his friends. But we also know he was so much more. So Jesus embraced his membership in the whole family of creation, and more specifically, the human family, as a great sign of love. The divinity of Jesus is not diminished by this. The infant born in the stable is also the second person of the Trinity, who is present at the beginning of time and is working to draw all of creation towards its goal, wholeness in God. And I love how Pope Francis writes of this. He writes, Christ has taken onto himself this material world, and now risen is intimately present to each being, surrounding it with his affection and penetrating it with his light. It's paragraph 221. Now, mutual belonging is made possible at the beginning of time, now, and at end time, thanks to Christ. No one is excluded, and this is an extension of authentic table fellowship experienced by the disciples during Christ's life and ministry and death and resurrection. Creation care today should be an extension of Jesus' invitation to do this in memory of me. So authentic table fellowship does not tolerate when people are dying and made sick by toxins from coal-fired power plants or other toxic facilities. It does not tolerate when it's easier to find a bag of Cheetos in a community than blueberries. It doesn't tolerate when our sisters and brothers from West Virginia to Tennessee are breathing toxic ash because of our energy-dependent lifestyles. Nor does it tolerate when our sisters and brothers of color and the poor living in our world are losing their homes because of rising sea levels. So Pope Francis is clear: when we fail to acknowledge as part of reality the worth of a poor person, a human embryo, a person with disabilities, and others, it becomes difficult to hear the cry of nature itself. Everything is connected, and everything shares in the destiny of wholeness in the risen Christ. And the final signpost I want to invite you to is the next slide, the Trinity. So all 7 of Catholic social teachings resonate a core belief that we can and should live in right relationship with God and creation, including all of our human sisters and brothers. It is the Trinity can be the model and source for building this new beloved community. God the Creator is the ultimate source of everything. The Son intimately united himself with earth. And the Spirit is the creative dynamism and bond of love that at the heart of the universe beats. They're in a perfect communion. They have perfected being with another. They are eternally in right relationship, and this is what we need to strive for. We exist on our planet because of the webs of ecological, social, and spiritual relationships. We're not independent of them, and the Trinity is the source of this interconnectivity. So Pope Francis writes about this. He said, when we contemplate with wonder the universe in all its grandeur and beauty, we must praise the whole Trinity. Paragraph 238. The Trinity has left its mark on creation, and if we would only notice it. Holy noticing will inspire us to create empowering relations of love that enable abundant life for all. And it will let us recognize when this is not happening and work tenaciously to fix it. So why should we do creation work, environmental justice work? It's because it's in the image and likeness of the divine triune family. We need to learn to be with others better. We need to get to know our neighbors better. We need to awaken to how interdependent we are with our neighbors and how we create love and life together. Then the development of renewable energy sources is what we just naturally do, or reusing clothing, or advocating for those disproportionately impacted by COVID. It's just what we do as Catholics and as Christians. Dismantling systemic racism becomes a core issue of who we are as Catholics who believe in the Trinity. But I want to leave you, the last thought I want to leave with you is from Pope Francis. So if the human person grows more, matures more, is sanctified more to the extent that he or she enters into relationships going out of themselves to live in communion with God, with others, and with all creatures. In this way, they make their own the Trinitarian dynamism which God imprinted on them when they were created. Everything is interconnected, and this invites us to develop a spirituality of global solidarity that flows from the mystery of the Trinity. Praise be. So next slide. So thank you so much for letting me share my thoughts with you.
Thank you, Catherine. I'm going to leave you with one statement that came in. It was asked that I tell you that this was beautifully said, and to thank you for your spirit-filled message, which I will second. Thank you. At this point, let me switch it so that Veronica will have, hold on, I'm giving you mouse control, Veronica.
Okay.
Let me take it away from Catherine and make sure that you've got it. Yep, you should be able to proceed, Veronica.
All right. So hello, everyone. I'm Veronica. I'm the Executive Director with the Center for Coalfield Justice. And I'm going to talk to you a little bit about our organization, my story to being an environmental justice activist, and what are some best practices to do when engaging with environmental justice communities. Let me see.
You may need to click twice for it to move. There.
Okay, there we go. So I just wanted to share this definition of environmental justice that one thing we'll usually share is like governments have definitions of environmental justice, which usually is like classified as, you know, X community living in X percentage of poverty or X percentage people of color is deemed an environmental justice community. In our perspective, that is not enough to actually assess if a community is being unfairly and unjustly harmed by environmental pollution, environmental classism, and racism and targeted that way. So this definition that we use is kind of like, if there's true environmental justice happening, it means that the fair treatment of people of all races, income levels, and cultures with respect to development, implementation, and enforcement of environmental laws, regulations, policies, and their meaningful involvement in that government decision process are happening. So what that means is if a coal plant is coming to a community that is already dealing with the impacts of systemic poverty or racism, they have a say of whether or not that plant comes into their community, and they have a say in how it operates and what are the restrictions put on place of that plant in their community. And so our organization kind of works in these 4 pillars of issue area, and we work in kind of 3 core ways. And so we are based in the very southwestern corner of Pennsylvania in kind of the crosshairs at the intersection of extreme coal mining and extreme extraction for oil and gas and petrochemical development. And so our first pillar and where we work is around issues related to coal and the use of coal, oil and gas, petro, so fracking and petrochemical developments, refineries, plastic making, and then the economy, because in our communities, you can't talk about fossil fuel extraction and not talk about the economy, or if you are doing it without talking about the economy, you're missing a huge intersection point, in which was raised before, because the county I grew up in and still live in, you know, its economy is dominated by fossil fuel extraction. And if you were to shut that all down in one day without any plan moving forward, you would still end up with massive poverty, extreme flight. You wouldn't solve the real issues of the community living there. And our economic work entails a lot of racial justice in it too. We really look at who has historically had access to good paying jobs, whose labor has been left out and marginalized. And as we're shifting our economies forward, all people's work should be valued. An example of that is women's labor in a lot of rural communities and even across the country and globally is undervalued and often not compensated. And that as we're moving our economic future forward, that labor needs to be recognized and compensated for. And then civic engagement is kind of our 4th pillar, and it ties to all of them. If we're not talking to who holds power, if we're not influencing who holds power, not ensuring people are voting in the elections, are educated about who they're voting for, we're never going to shift the dynamics going forward. And then the 3 areas we work in, before I kind of go a little bit more into how I got here, is, we do education, advocacy, and organizing. So education is twofold. We need to make sure the residents who are living here are aware of what their rights are when the land agent comes knocking on their door, as well as we need to educate people who aren't from here what the cost of affordable energy means in some places. It's only, one of the things we say is like, energy is only cheap right now because companies are externalizing so much of their cost onto the surrounding communities. And then our advocacy is as small as, filing a comment on a permit, to organizing mass action against an operator or the state, to like filing litigation and suing a coal company or the state for violating our rights. And then organizing is the bread and butter of our work. And so in our organizing, we're connecting people who are like-minded and impacted together to have the larger collective power of our region. We're never going to overturn the systems and get true justice on our own, but we do truly have the power in number. And we teach people how to analyze the problem, figure out who holds the power, and know what levers you can push to change the power dynamics at play. And so I came to this work as a teenager, and what you're looking at here is kind of what introduced me to environmental harms from the beginning. So I was living in Western Greene County. This is the Bailey mine that was referenced in my bio. And this is the waste impoundments, or toxic valley fills, as I like to call them, that are associated with coal mining anywhere, no matter what type of coal mining is happening in the country or in the world, these waste facilities have to exist next to them. And so I actually grew up just over the hill from this facility. And when it was expanding when I was a teenager, I just didn't think it was right. I had not a huge connection to the impact on people or the community, but a lot of question about the wildlife, the creatures that were living in these hills that all of a sudden like had their homes destroyed, and what happens with that. I, in this time frame, recognized later, was very privileged in the aspect that my family was not dependent upon employment from the coal industry. And so when I always describe these years as like not really organizing, but just being kind of angry and yelling a lot at coal executives, and was so surprised at how little the people in my community wanted to also speak out against the injustice that was happening, and later learned and realized it was because of how many folks needed to keep quiet, even if they didn't agree with what was happening, because that was their place of employment. And that was the only way they were keeping their families housed and fed in our communities. And so, we talk about in these communities that leadership investment is so critical, and letting community members who are directly impacted drive campaigns and make strategic decisions is super important. And so through this time frame, fortunately, the Center for Coalfield Justice, I had accidentally found them as an organization, and they invested in me as a leader. I went from an angry young adult yelling a lot about something that was wrong, to being taught the systemic ways of what was happening, to being teachings around organizing, around talking to folks and pushing the power dynamics, to now being the director of our organization that's running, a community of leaders now that are fighting for true justice in their communities. So if you invest in the people that may not seem effective at addressing the problem, they can become the strongest leaders to create the change going forward. I also just wanted to show, my work is still in this. I'm obviously not living next to that operation anymore, although my parents still reside there. I live on the eastern side of the county, so you'll see the like kind of straight edge is the western half, and the wiggly edge, which is the Monongahela River, is the eastern half. But what you're seeing in this map is all of the fossil fuel extraction in this one county. So the kind of red blocks and yellow rectangles of operation or longwall mining coal operations, underground coal operations, and all the little like dots and the kind of tiny lines that you see, those are all the shale gas or fracking wells. And that's out of date. Those are probably triple what they are right now. So it is actually not possible for someone to live in this county and not be impacted by coal mining or impacted by shale gas or fracking operations in the county. So there is no safe community that isn't impacted by pollution somehow, as well as these operations are huge tax base providers. Are, 40% of our budget comes from coal taxes in the community at the county level. Some school districts get $2 to $3 million of their budget from coal taxes. So if coal were to collapse, you can see how the intersecting impact is compound in these places. But we do this by, I wanted to show these inspiring images of shifting the narrative, giving residents the collective ability to show power, and working across coalition. We are a rural community that only has so many people, that will only have so much power. But when we build relationships, when we, form strong coalitions, and that includes coalitions with faith leaders, indigenous communities, workers, we can create change. And so in these images, the bottom left is a coalition of residents all throughout the Ohio River Valley that are fighting the onslaught of new petrochemical development as our economic solution to the future. And in the bottom right, this is an example of a direct action that is at an industrial kind of corporate business park in our community, where there are the headquarters of 13 different fossil fuel energy companies. And we kind of took the impact we feel in our communities on a daily basis to these CEOs and executives of having to wait in traffic to get to work for a little bit. The upper right corner is retired coal miners that we worked with to get the company to reinstate their health care after they unjustly cut it. And these were the men and women that made the company a Fortune 500 company over the years. And in the upper left corner, this was the same day that the blockade is happening in the lower right corner. And this is a coalition of activists that are being impacted by oil and gas development across the country, who marched to all of these headquarters sites and left the images of lost loved ones due to the impact of oil and gas, so that they know their paper pushing or their decision making in these ivory towers have real impact to life in communities too. And so we know how to show our power collectively, and we're still doing it to this day. And so I wanted to touch on, as church leaders, as schools, as folks who are, striving to do environmental justice work, but may not always be the person directly impacted by the injustice, what are some best practices or principles for working with communities and together holistically in these coalitions too? And so there is something called the Hermes Principles for Democratic Organizing, and we'll send a link with the full write-up of them, but these were created in 1996 from 40 people of color and European Americans met in Jemez, New Mexico, to really talk about, it was a working group meeting on the globalization and trade. And it was to really try to hash out some inequities that were happening between labor, frontline environmental justice, indigenous communities, and big greens, big environmental organizations. And they all kind of came together with the agreement that we should operate under these principles in our organizing. And the first principle is to be inclusive. And this is more than just, tokenizing to make sure there's diversity on your boards or your decision making, but making sure that there is true diversity and engagement where decisions are being made, where staffing is happening. And this is really about building an alternative institution, moving forward and not compromising. This means the work may go slower. This means you might have to figure out how to make relationships with people who aren't showing up. And something we do in our organization, often we'll hear from different leaders in the community, well, we held a meeting and those people didn't come, or we keep trying to get in touch with them, but we're not getting a response. Well, our framing is always, it's not their fault that they're not engaging. It's like, what are we doing wrong that's not making the space welcoming or inclusive or accessible to them? And that can be questions like, do we have childcare present? Are we holding it at a time that most of them are working and not able to come? Is there food being provided? Because people who work a lot and are struggling need to make sure they're eating if you hold a meeting during dinner time or those hours. Are we able to provide stipends to help them get there for travel? We do rural work, and some people live 30-40 minutes away from where we're meeting, and that could be a big cost. So we offer gas cards at a lot of our meetings for people to be there and engage too. And so it's often asking what you're not doing to make the space welcome or inclusive for everyone of all backgrounds to participate. The second one is an emphasis on bottom-up organizing. And this really means that, we're building constituencies, investing in leadership and a membership base that is the most impacted. And we're letting the ground drive the strategy. We're letting the bottom up move forward the solutions. And there's this misnomer that sometimes the people who are impacted aren't educated enough or don't really know what's best for them. But what we have found in our work is like those who are the most impacted have the best and most creative solutions to drive it forward. People with power just don't listen to them. They don't take them seriously. They make assumptions about them. And then there's letting people speak for themselves. And a key thing about this is it's important to not talk for those who are the most impacted. Let them talk for themselves, but it doesn't mean you don't have a role in the work, in the movement, and speaking. It means like it's important for your organization to clarify your role, know who you represent, and assure accountability within those structures. So if you're a church whose parish is majority white, you shouldn't be the ones talking loudly about racism, but there's a role that white folks have to play in dismantling white supremacy and knowing how you communicate and share your role in all of that with white folks or with your parish. And then the fourth one is that we work together in solidarity and mutuality. And this is really rooted in relationship as well too. I think a core thing I'll lift up out of here is that we're really sharing strategies, we're really sharing resources, and it's critical for us when one of us is in more need than the other to step up and be there with each other. A way that this has looked in our work is with workers. It sometimes is like not heard of that an environmental organization is standing with coal miners, but in that moment when the retired coal miners' healthcare was cut, we sat at a table. We didn't necessarily agree on climate change at the moment, but we did agree that they deserve healthcare and that the company had a responsibility to keep it instated for them. And we came together and we stood in solidarity and mutuality and worked together. Later on down the line, when that same coal company was impacting a public park in our community, we had these very same miners calling this company and saying, stop your operations, don't undermine the public lands, it's a critical resource to the community. And so, ways in which you can kind of put aside your initial wants or drive to build that relationship and operate in true solidarity can create like beautiful possibilities in the outcome of it. Again, building just relationship among ourselves and with our partners. This means, being really clear about accountability, transparency. You have to have clarity about the decision making and your structure, the strategies that you're doing, resource distribution. I know there can often be a lot of critiques in faith communities of the amount of money that sometimes exist and inequities that can happen around that. Or I also, one of my stories, I grew up Catholic in the county that I live in. The church I went to, you could actually see the coal operation. There were a lot of coal miners and coal executives that also went to this parish. And even though all of this like massive injustice was happening to the people and environment from coal mining, our parish leaders would never say anything. And it was because of the fear of losing parishioners. And there is a dynamic in that church. That church still needs money to survive. A lot of that money is also coming from the coal operations. And so I just think transparency around that, why decisions are being made or not being made, is what is going to grow just relationships among people. And then commitment to self-transformation. And this means we must change from operating on the model of individualism to community-centeredness, and we must walk our talk that we're saying. So if we want a world to be created where everyone is treated equally and fairly, we better make sure we're actually operating that way in our institutions and our structures, that everyone is treated equally and fairly. And sometimes this means, particularly in situations where, you know, massive classism is happening and racism is happening, we look inward on our parishes, our institutions. You know, why at one point in time in our organization, we had leadership that would not say anything against racism or white supremacy for fear of losing membership and base. And when I transitioned into leadership, the question for me was not that we don't say anything. It means we say something strategically, which means we need to do the self-transformation of our members and our base. You know, we don't want to just be building white power in these rural communities. We want to be building multiracial power. And so some of our work for a better world means we have to look inward and transform ourselves, transform our institutions as well. And so there's, you know, I wanted to kind of leave it with, there's a lot of what you can do. And one of the things we hear a lot sometimes is, well, there isn't any environmental justice communities near me, or there's like nothing happening in my community, which is likely not the truth. Like, there is environmental injustice happening everywhere across this entire country and across the world. In some places, it's at a larger scale than other places. And so one of the things you can do is figure out where that is, invest in those impacted communities, show up to their spaces, don't expect them just to come to your space, and see what the needs are and the role that your organization can have in it. When you see injustice, speak out against it, and talk to your members, your base, about what that means, even if they're not directly impacted by it. And then using your resources, your networks, to amplify the voices of the people that are the most impacted. And one way that churches in our community do this is they give us free meeting spaces. A lot of churches often have meeting locations, places, and they allow us to congregate, to organize, to strategize, and have access to those spaces. And that was all I had, and we're here for some questions. Sorry if I went a little over time.
Oh, it's fine. Thank you, Veronica. We move now into our Q&A time. Before we do that, though, we seem to be having a lot of technical issues with people's audio. So hopefully those that are hearing this as a recording will forgive us for the technical issue that must have happened today. As we move into questions, the first one, I believe, is for Catherine. And it's, how can the whole issue of integral creation care, the message of dealing with this issue integrally, both nature and justice for those that are disenfranchised, the poor, the folks in communities of color, how can this issue arrive into our homilies, to the pews in our churches? And I know that you and I have spoken a little about this, so hopefully you'll have a brilliant answer. I think you're muted, Catherine.
Yes, I think it's a question I ask often, and I know, Veronica, you said as well, like, you didn't hear it. You could see the coal and you could see what was happening, and you didn't hear it. Well, one of the ways that it goes into the homily, I believe, is through self-reflection and education on the part of our pastors. One of the things that I have found, and again, personally, I went to Regis College in Toronto. I worked with a lot of Jesuits. I worked with a lot of Basilians at St. Michael's College. I worked with a lot of Passionist priests. So I've had access to many different kind of observations. And one of the things they kept telling me was that, especially in our medical ethics class, was that they went into high school and science was not their thing, and they moved into literature, they moved into philosophy, and that continued into their seminary formation, and was more heavily on the humanities. So there's an unfamiliarity of the specifics with respect to talking about the science of what's happening. Now, when I say science, I don't mean that you need to know the molecular structure of these different organizations like coal, and to understand all these different aspects. But you can't speak knowledgeably with heart if you don't understand what's actually happening to the water and the pollution, and that takes an ecological literacy, and there needs to be a sense of learning in our seminarians. And I can show you in Laudato Si where he said our seminary should be a home for this. It hasn't quite made it there because often there aren't as many people who are very familiar with science. And I'm teaching in North Carolina now, and there is a dichotomy between religion and science. So when I teach classes, I have people that are in my class that are saying evolution doesn't exist. So my education has to even go further back to meet them where they're at, to get to a point where we can start talking about this intersectionality. The only way you can have intersectionality is if you have a familiarity of what is actually going on, whether it's people. And I really appreciated, Veronica, when you said you can't speak for other people. No, you can listen and know your role, but there's a familiarity. The more you have faces and names and stories that inform your theology, then you can have a homily about it. Then you can speak. But the science is usually weaker. And that's just one observation. And I taught science from grade 4 all the way up through Catholic teachers, and the same I found, unless you're a science teacher. And so it's that ecological literacy that is needed, and that self-reflection and self-transformation. But I haven't been invited to seminaries. I haven't been invited to walk with individuals who are crafting homilies. And we spoke a little bit in the Protestant tradition. It is from the pulpit a lot more. There's a lot more. And I think that's an area for self-transformation within the Catholic Church. And I'm willing to walk with anyone and teach. If I can teach grade 4s to love science, then I can walk with others and learn from others. So that's kind of, I don't know if you want to add anything, Veronica, why maybe you didn't hear, and how this integral creation could be spoken about.
I mean, my experience with the Catholic Church as a teenager was a little like touch and go, because there were also like the guys who were running the operations were also going to church with me and like telling me to stop speaking out like after church. And so it was this weird dynamic. But the thing that it leads to me to think though is like doing the work within the church. And sometimes I think there can be a hesitancy to take risk. And what we've learned as an organization is we've made bold statements around controversial issues in our community. We work in a very conservative place. And what that has done is actually sparked dialogue. So sometimes the risk can actually lead to the transformation, and to spark the dialogue. And I think particularly for priests and leaders within the Catholic Church who hold so much respect in some of these communities could really make someone who is like struggling in these political moments to figure out what's right and what's moral, to like take the step into that dialogue, into that self-learning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is totally true. I think we're going to have time for one question, probably, Veronica. You're not going to have a lot of time to answer it, but I'm putting several questions together, and it has to do with many times our communities react better with a non-confrontational approach. Have you had any success dealing with companies when it's not confrontational, in dialogue, or has it always have to be confrontational? And the second kind of corollary is, have you ever had religious institution conversations about the stock that they hold in these companies?
The divestment one, we haven't really, like, we aren't super engaged in the divestment movement, but there are those who are. There's a whole movement that's talking to universities, religious institutions, and how to divest and reinvest from fossil fuels. So I think maybe I try to find a resource to send to you, Paz, so you can share that. But I will say is like, we don't start aggressive. Like, obviously there's an escalation to get the results happen. So we do always try to talk to the state and the operator to change their operations, to reduce the impact, to shift. And the state park is an example. We asked them just to cut their operations a little bit short, don't undermine public lands, and they would still make a profit. They would still provide employees, all of this. And they chose to ignore the entire time, the state. And so like when they don't listen to you and you ask nicely, you have to escalate up. So this picture, we don't start with direct action. Like, that's the end point. We do an escalation of trying to pressure them nicely. And if they continue to ignore you, you don't have an option. We never had faith on our side in our communities. And so maybe if we did have churches standing with us at the non-confrontational phase, that could have pushed them more on a morality or not. But we had an absence in our community, unfortunately, of faith leaders standing with us.
So that's the answer to this question, that the faith community has to step up at that point too. I would keep going, but unfortunately we are out of time. Somebody did ask about these links on your slide. Do know that the recording and the PowerPoint slides will be accessible to everybody, so they're going to get that. At this point, I want to thank you, Veronica and Catherine, for being here with us and sharing your knowledge and wisdom and expertise. Thank you, and thank you to all that joined us today. And I do apologize for the technical issues on audio that seems to have happened. But thank you all. Take care.
Bye.
Bye-bye, everybody. Thanks.